On the evening of January 15, 1980, a 19-year-old college student in Gresham, Oregon was heading to class. It was a cold winter night. She had told her mother earlier that day that she hoped class would end early because she wanted to visit her friend and get ice cream. She never made it to class. She never made it to her friend. Drivers swerved around her as she ran into the road waving her arms, gesturing for help. Nobody stopped. A man pulled her back into the trees. The next morning, students on their way to campus found her body in the bushes. Her name was Barbara Mae Tucker. And it would take 44 years, a genealogy company, a detective's promise, and a piece of chewing gum spat onto the ground for the world to learn the name of the man who killed her. Gresham sits on the eastern edge of the Portland metro area in Oregon. In 1980, it was a working-class suburban city, modest neighborhoods, a small downtown, the kind of place where families settled and lived quietly. Mount Hood Community College sat on the edge of town, and Barbara Tucker was one of its students. She was a sophomore, studying business. She was 19 years old. She was the youngest of 7 siblings in a blended family. People who knew her said she was tall, 5'11", athletic, the kind of girl who had played basketball in high school and carried herself with the ease of someone comfortable in her own skin. Her family called her Barbie. On the evening of January 15, she was on her way to a night class. Sometime close to 7 o'clock in the evening, near the wooded western edge of campus along Northeast Kane Drive, something went wrong. Witnesses later told police they saw a young woman run out of a wooded area onto the road. She was waving. She was trying to get someone to stop. Drivers swerved around her. Some later said they noticed blood and mud on her face. One witness watched as a man emerged from the bushes and led her back toward campus. Nobody intervened. Nobody called anyone. They drove on. The following morning, January 16, 1980, students arriving for early classes at Mount Hood Community College found Barbara Tucker's body in a wooded area between Kane Road and a campus parking lot. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. She was 19 years old. She had wanted to get ice cream that night. The Gresham Police Department opened a homicide investigation immediately. Investigators worked the scene, collected evidence, interviewed anyone who had seen anything near the campus that evening. The witnesses who had watched Barbara run into the road were interviewed. The description of the man who led her back into the trees was recorded. Detectives followed every lead the evidence and the witness accounts produced. It wasn't enough. To understand why this case went cold, you have to understand what 1980 meant for forensic investigation. DNA analysis did not exist as an investigative tool. The technique was still years away from being developed, let alone being used by police departments. What investigators had was physical evidence, witness statements, and whatever traditional methods the era allowed. They had a description of a man. They had a crime scene. They had a dead 19-year-old. What they did not have was a name, and without a name, every road eventually ran out. The biological evidence collected from Barbara's body during her autopsy was preserved. That decision, made by someone in 1980 who may not have fully understood what it would one day make possible, is the reason this case was ever solved. But for a very long time, it produced nothing. The file went onto a shelf. Detectives rotated through. New investigators reviewed the evidence, found nothing actionable, and moved on. The trail had been cold almost from the beginning. Barbara's family waited. They kept asking. They received updates that amounted to nothing changing. And still, the man who killed her was out there, living in the same metro area where he had committed the crime, going about his life, unreachable. Barbara's father, Albert Tucker, died in 1989. He never knew who killed his daughter. Her mother, Louise Tucker, died in 1995. She never knew either. The case that had defined the worst moment of their lives closed without resolution, and they went to their graves carrying it. Barbara's sister Susan Pater kept going. She carried the weight of it for 44 years. In an interview after the eventual arrest, she said what the family had lived with in one sentence: "Someone brutally took her away from us when she was so young, and went on living their life after." That was the reality. Somewhere, the man who had beaten Barbara Tucker to death on a January evening in 1980 was waking up every morning and living his life. And Barbara's family knew it. And there was nothing they could do. In 2000, 20 years after the murder, investigators sent the vaginal swabs taken during Barbara's autopsy to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab for analysis. The lab developed a DNA profile from the swabs. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of the man who had killed Barbara Tucker. They ran it through available databases. No match came back. The profile was filed and held, waiting for a name to attach to it. It waited for another 15 years. In 2015, Detective Aaron Turnage of the Gresham Police Department was assigned the case. He was handed it on the anniversary of Barbara's murder. He later described what he inherited: "When I received the case I knew there had been 35 years of various detectives that worked it, and it was a lot of reports, paperwork, and evidence I needed to sift through." Criminalist Deanna Grossi worked alongside him, reviewing the physical evidence and tracking advances in forensic technique. Together, they were looking for the door that earlier investigators hadn't been able to find. Turnage made a promise to Barbara's family. He told them he would not stop until the case was solved. In a profession where cold cases regularly outlast the careers of everyone who touches them, that is not a small thing to say. He meant it. The door he found was genetic genealogy. By 2021, investigative genetic genealogy had become the most powerful tool available for cold cases with unmatched DNA profiles. It had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018 after decades of failure through traditional methods, and since then had been applied to hundreds of unsolved cases around the country. The principle is different from traditional DNA databases. Instead of running an unknown profile against convicted offenders, investigators upload it to consumer ancestry platforms, the same services millions of ordinary people use to trace their family trees, and look for partial biological matches among people who have voluntarily submitted their own DNA. When matches appear, genealogists build family trees outward from those distant relatives, cross-referencing public records, working backward through generations until they can identify which specific individual in that family the crime scene DNA most likely came from. Detective Turnage sent the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that does this work for law enforcement. The genealogist who took on the case was C.C. Moore, one of the most prominent figures in the investigative genetic genealogy field. It took time. It always takes time. But eventually the work produced what 35 years of traditional investigation had not: a direction, a family, a name. It took several years, Turnage said later, but finally, a strong enough match was made to point us in the direction of the Plympton family. The name that emerged was Robert Plympton. He was living in Troutdale, Oregon, still in the Portland metro area, the same general geography where he had killed Barbara Tucker 41 years earlier. He had a wife. He had a son. He had built a quiet suburban life on top of what he had done in 1980. A genetic genealogy match is a lead, not a conviction. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample from Plympton, collected covertly, so that he had no warning of what was coming. They put him under surveillance. They watched him go about his daily routine. At some point during that surveillance, Robert Plympton chewed a piece of gum and spat it on the ground. Detectives collected it. The gum went to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. The analysis came back. The DNA profile developed from the gum matched the DNA profile developed from the vaginal swabs taken from Barbara Tucker's body in 1980 and preserved for over 40 years. The match was confirmed. On June 8, 2021, Detective Aaron Turnage and his colleagues went to arrest Robert Plympton. They took him into custody in front of Mount Hood Community College, literally within a few hundred feet of where he had kidnapped Barbara Tucker on the night of January 15, 1980. The same ground. 41 years later. That night, a detective knocked on Susan Pater's door and told her what had happened. She later described the moment, just not giving up. We always had hope. At one point we thought he was dead. Maybe it would never be solved. I just wished it could have happened when the rest of my family was here, especially my parents. Robert Plympton was 16 years old when he killed Barbara Tucker. He was 58 when he was arrested. There was no known connection between him and Barbara, no evidence they had ever spoken, crossed paths, or shared any prior contact. He had simply encountered her near the campus that night and decided to take her life. He pleaded not guilty. He chose a bench trial, a trial decided by a judge, not a jury. The trial ran from February 26 to March 15, 2024, before Multnomah County Circuit Judge Amy Baggio. Chief Deputy District Attorney Kirsten Snowden and Senior Deputy District Attorney Todd Jackson prosecuted the case. The evidence accumulated across 44 years was presented in a courtroom for the first time, physical evidence that Barbara's family's sister described as worse than anything she had ever seen in a horror film. The judge found Plympton not guilty of rape, because prosecutors could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the sexual assault had occurred while Barbara was still alive. But on the question of murder, the evidence was unambiguous. On March 15, 2024, Judge Amy Baggio found Robert Plympton guilty of 1 count of murder in the first degree and 4 counts of murder in the second degree. On October 3, 2024, Robert Plympton stood before Judge Kelly Skye for sentencing. He was 61 years old. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was transferred immediately into the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. He will not walk free. Barbara Mae Tucker was 19 years old. She was the youngest of 7 children. She played basketball in high school. She was studying business at Mount Hood Community College. She wanted to get ice cream with a friend on the night she was killed. She ran into the road waving her arms asking for help, and nobody stopped. Her father died in 1989 without knowing who did it. Her mother died in 1995 without knowing who did it. Her sister carried that absence for 44 years, through every anniversary, every update that led nowhere, every year the file sat cold. What closed it was a piece of chewing gum. And a detective who made a promise in 2015 and kept it. And a genealogist who built a family tree from anonymous DNA matches in a consumer ancestry database until one branch pointed to a man in Troutdale living an ordinary life. And biological evidence collected in 1980 by investigators who preserved it carefully enough that 4 decades later it could still be matched to a suspect's spit on a sidewalk. All of those things had to align. And eventually, they did. Barbara Tucker deserved more than 44 years. She deserved to have finished that class and gone for ice cream. She deserved to have had the entire life that was taken from her on a January evening in Gresham. What her family got instead was a verdict. A life sentence. A detective who knocked on their door in the middle of the night and told them it was over. And the knowledge that the man who killed her, who went on living his life after, just as Susan Pater said, will spend whatever years remain to him inside a prison cell. If this stayed with you, subscribe, and leave a word for Barbara's family.